We're about fighting and winning on battlefields. And we're all about readiness. We're all about readiness now and readiness in the future and modernization. I think the accusations of woke are grossly over-exaggerated.
Over-exaggerated. No, but you're making too much of it. That's fine, but you know who's not making too much of it? The recruits who aren't showing up. The people who are in and are getting out. Our retention is as frightening as our recruiting. Joining me now, United States Marine Lieutenant Colonel Dakota Wood. He's the Senior Research Fellow, Heritage Foundation. Colonel, look, Mark Milley, the new chairman, they can all say what they want. It's overblown. They're making too much of it. I see the recruiting numbers, Colonel, and I know dang well that you know the retention numbers, and a lot of people seem to be making a lot of it.
Yeah, you know, perceptions really are reality in these things. You know, a recruiter goes to a high school or a ballpark or wherever, or parents might be, you know, guiding or suggesting or mentoring their children as to career paths. And do you want to join the military? So we can look at all kinds of statistics about tactical readiness in the forces, whether people are proficient with their airplane or their machine gun or whatever that is. But if the perception is the Defense Department has gone woke, you know, if you have to worry about preferred pronouns on your email signature block, or you think that promotions are tied to, you know, racial or ethnic identity, right? Or you want this kaleidoscope of people at senior ranks, that perception is going to deter people, convince them not to join an organization when they might as well join Google or Microsoft or someplace else and make 4 times the amount of money.
Can you explain what you're talking about when you talk about proficiency? How proficient are we? Or do we have a deficiency of proficiency? I swear I didn't do that on purpose, but are we ready for whatever may come?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. You know, in the ground level, when you've got troops and they're out there firing their artillery tables or maneuvering to contact in the training scenario, we've got good people in the military services, and they're led by some really good leadership there at the small unit level. But then you look at a statistic like in the Air Force, where they are so short of pilots that if you are drawing a breath every morning, you're going to be a pilot in the U.S. Air Force. Their graduation rate is near 100%. And the only pilots in that pilot training pipeline, another alliteration there, who don't make it for proficiency reasons is less than 0.25%. All captains in the U.S. Army are automatically being promoted to major. So there is this personnel issue in the military where we have so few people willing to join, and the re-up rate that you mentioned, you know, retaining people already in the service is so problematic that we see standards declining in order to keep as many people in their seats as possible. So in some ways, really good training, really good people doing right things. In other areas, ships that go out 15% undermanned, squadrons of Air Force fighters that were used to have 24 airplanes in a squadron, now you have 18, but the Air Force says, yes, we've got fully manned squadrons. So it's only because you reduce the number of airplanes to match your pilots and maintainers, right? So it's a mixed message out there. But the real story, as you're pointing out, is this perception of the military. Is it ready? Is it an organization I want to join? And I think that is really a problem story that most Americans don't fully appreciate.
Why don't we have enough pilots, Colonel? Look, every young man who's ever watched Top Gun wants to sit in a fighter jet and talk to pretty girls about the missiles he shoots for a living. Every young man dreams of that. We can't even get people to be pilots now?
Well, you would want to be able to do the things that you sign up to do. And so back in the Cold War, the average pilot in the Air Force would fly easily in excess of 200 hours a year. So you're flying somewhere between 3 and 5 times a week on a regular basis every week. Today, the average pilot gets 130 hours or less. Most of them are below 120. And in some of our frontline fighter squadrons, they're down in the 90 hours. What that means is you're flying about 1 time a week. So if I signed up to join the service in order to fly these cool jets, but I'm only flying it once a week for about an hour and a half, Well, what am I doing with the rest of my time? And you can't tell me that time in a simulator is the same thrill and the same excitement and sense of fulfillment that actually getting in an F-35 or an F-16 gives me.
Why aren't they flying more? Are we out of gas or something?
Well, part of it is funding. So it costs so many dollars per flight hour, and that goes into the fuel required, but it's also how many maintainers do you have on the flight line. So, after a flight, you have to check the aircraft to make sure everything is good. These aren't commercial airplanes. I mean, they pull high Gs, high pressure maneuvers. There's just a lot going on in this airframe that we demand of it. So you have to do these maintenance checks and services. So part of it is how many people are available to maintain the airplane. And then the other part, in addition to fuel costs, is do you have the repair parts? So maintaining something like your car at home or anything else, you've got to spend the money to have the parts to fix those things that wear out. So if our defense budget doesn't keep pace with the cost of maintaining things, then you don't have as many operational aircraft. If you don't have the aircraft to fly, then the pilots who would normally get time in that airplane, the airplane's not there, I don't get my flying time, and so I don't have the flight hours during the year. The reality is that our defense budgets have not kept pace for inflation for something like 30 years. And I can give you just a boatload of examples of how expenses have far exceeded our willingness to fund the defense accounts, and we see the consequences of that in these sorts of numbers that I've shared.
The average American, understandably, does not understand how secure the U.S. Navy, as much as it pains me to say that, keeps this nation safe. 2 gigantic oceans. Our U.S. Navy is by far the best in the world, and they also don't understand how it's also slowly but surely rotting out from underneath us. Can you speak to that, Colonel?
Yeah, again, the Cold War is just a great reference point. I mean, it's kind of in history books for most people these days, but it was a period of time when we were engaged with a massive opponent, the Soviet Union, truly on a global stage. Pacific, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Arctic Oceans, planes in the air all the time, nuclear-armed bombers on 24-hour, alert. I mean, it was a big thing. So when you think about today with Russia and China and Iran, a very, very messy world. So when we look at the Cold War as an example, we had almost 600 ships in the U.S. Navy. Today, and I checked the numbers this morning, we have 291. So half the fleet that we did, and yet the world is as big as it's ever been, and we actually have more enemies out there than we did in the Soviet Union. So if you have half the ships and you're still trying to keep the same number deployed to cover down on, missiles off of, Yemen from the Houthis, mischiefs going on in the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf with the Iranians, China potentially invading Taiwan. There's just a lot of stuff going on. It means you're using those ships twice as much because you only have half as many, which wear out the crew, it wears out the ships, you don't have the money to repair the ships. And so it's a circle that just evolves into this sort of inconsistency and problematic ship availability to secure our own borders.
How's China's Navy? Obviously, I'm very concerned about theirs compared to ours.
Yeah, they're at 360 ships and counting. Most analysts assess that they'll have near 400 easily before 2030, so in the next 5 or 6 years. So 360 versus our almost 300, 291, you wouldn't say, well, that's kind of close. Well, not really, because the U.S. Navy only keeps about 100 ships out at sea in the world on any given day, and only about 60 of those are dedicated to the Indo-Pacific, that part of the Western Pacific facing Japan and Korea and China. So when you look at 60 ships versus 360, it's a 6-to-1 advantage favoring China. Plus, our ships are operating 6,000 or 7,000 miles from home, whereas China's are operating about 200 or 300 miles from their shore. So they can be covered by all the land-based anti-ship missiles, land-based aircraft that can fly out a couple hundred miles and shoot things at our ships. So the numbers dramatically favor China in any kind of contest in that part of the world. And it just goes to show you how important numbers really matter if you're thinking you're going to take any losses in combat. And I think battlefields in Ukraine and elsewhere show that losses are a feature of warfare.